All right, all right. So you might be asking, why is Quorum hosting a webinar on stakeholder engagement? Well, it's a big part of what we do here. So you might have come to Quorum because of legislative tracking or grassroots advocacy or PAC management. But one of the big use cases and where a lot of our clients find the most value is in turning stakeholders into champions with great relationship mapping and meeting tracking, and also ways to improve your policy reputation or just organizational reputation at large with contact outreach and built-in or with our directories as well. With Quorum Stakeholder, it's a CRM built for public affairs. So like Quorum Federal has all federal contact information, Quorum State has state contact information baked in. Quorum Stakeholder is like your CRM for your network, which really helps you provide institutional knowledge on the folks in your community, on the key stakeholders for your organization, and also helps you enhance your team's reputation. Reputation is going to be the hard word for me to say this time. There's always one word during a webinar that I struggle with, and reputation is apparently it. Not in my reputation era. But it helps you with personalized outreach with built-in emails and also mobile access, and also just really helps you understand the relationships that you have with community members and other key stakeholders. And the thing that I think is the coolest part about this is that then you get this cross-team insights and reporting. So if you do lobbying work or if you do work on the federal or state side, it's not just those officials and their staff that really matter to your organization. It's a lot of folks outside of that as well that only really matter to you and your team, right? And so having that cross-team insight and reporting across everybody that matters to your team is super great to have all baked into one place. All right, and with that, we have the incredible Alissa Sevrioukova from DTE to walk us through how her team took a smarter approach to stakeholder engagement. Now, on the right-hand side of your screen, in that chat tab, I would love for you to drop in what was your summer job or your first job growing up. Alissa and I were just talking about this, and I thought it was really, really interesting. So my first job was at the local zoo, where I had like a rotation thing where I was working with the petting zoo area, but also with the wallabies and kangaroos. So my job was pretty much just to make sure that children weren't harassing the animals, which was not the most fun job in the world, though I did get a lot of time spent with kangaroos and wallabies. Alissa, how about you? What was your first job?
So both of my parents are researchers. And so my first summer job, when I think I was 14 and a half, I still had to get a permission slip signed, was actually working in my mom's lab, washing test tubes and other lab equipment. I was actually just sharing with Patrick, I kind of bragged. I mean, this was a $9 an hour job, which was incredible for 25 years ago. I could come in anytime I want, listen to music. So I feel like I kind of won the lottery with my first summer job.
That is really good. It also sounds like it could be like a superhero origin story of like you're washing on a test tube and like you got something, that maybe that's what you're able to. Yeah,
I
maybe
wish
you
I had
got
a
some
good
like
follow-up
stakeholder
to that.
skills. Yeah. All right, we got a bunch of folks in the chat. Jim Janitor, sales at Famous Footwear. I bet that had really good like employee discounts. Candy store. My first job out of college, like while I was like looking for real work, was at Dolcezza in DC, and I gained about 25 pounds. That's like a gelato shop. Lifeguard, yeah, I've seen a lot of lifeguards. Grocery store baggers. Do they still have that? Is that a job still? Because I think it sounds like really fun, like real life Tetris. All right. With that, Alissa, I'll go ahead and just hand it over to you to take it from here.
I appreciate it, Patrick, and good afternoon, everyone. I'm so excited to be here to share the journey that DTE has been on, and hopefully share something that might be insightful from you, but also excited to hear from you on what you're working on and maybe what's worked for you as we kind of move into the Q&A portion at the end. My name is Alissa Sevrioukova, as Patrick said. I am currently the Chief of Staff for Community Affairs here at DTE Energy. We are a Michigan-based utility that provides gas and electric service to about 4 million customers customers across the state of Michigan. And in my current role, I lead the strategy and operations for community affairs, where we focus on engaging non-governmental stakeholders, which include faith-based institutions, civic organizations, advocacy organizations, nonprofits, as well as engaging with our customers directly on behalf of DTE. I've been in this role for about 2 years, but I've been a DTE for a little over a decade. And in my previous roles at the company, I've also been kind of working in some way, shape, or form with the community. I actually started here in our neighborhood revitalization program and worked on a couple of physical projects, including a public space that we built just outside of our headquarters, and then spent about 5 or 6 years as the corporate social responsibility manager before I transitioned into my current role. So before I get into the kind of the presentation at large, I wanted to just give a little bit of background for those who might not be familiar with the utility industry. So as a utility, every resident, every community organization is our customer and our stakeholder, as long as they're in our service territory. And we are also a regulated utility, which means that, we have an oversight body that kind of guides our operations, approves our spend, but it also means that our mission and our obligation is to serve our customer first and foremost, and to do what's in their best interest. And so what this means is that having a strong, trusting, and positive relationship with the community is critical for our success as a company and in us achieving the mission of ultimately serving our customers in the best way possible. So the community affairs, community engagement function has been, because of this reason, has been around at DTE for decades. And we have gone through a series of kind of evolutions, definitely in the decade that I've been here, but I think even more so prior to my time here. So over the last decade, and kind of what I've witnessed and what I've been a part of is that we've operated for many years with a lot of success. We had a lot of longstanding relationships, trusted partnerships, and when we needed to, we could deliver on whatever it is that we were called on. But at the same time, there were some challenges that things weren't perfect, and there's things that we could improve on. Some of those things, in some part maybe stemmed from we were kind of regularly struggling to find a way to measure our work and measure our impact. We had metrics, we tracked them. Every few years, it felt like there would be an effort to kind of revamp them or find a new way to see what would stick. And it took us a while to land on where we are now. As part of that, we logged some of our engagements, some of our meetings, but without kind of clear metrics and maybe a clear connection to what that objective was. A lot of it was really tactical and missed the so what of kind of why we were tracking that information. And at the same time, we also had some pretty good structures. We had weekly metrics. We had or a scorecard we reported, to our leaders and other executives. We had weekly huddles. But again, because we didn't have kind of the metrics and the so what right, we weren't really kind of using those forums and that processes to drive that meaningful action that we wanted. And lastly, while we had this great base of stakeholders in our network, we used a variety of forums to kind of track or keep track of them. Excel was definitely one, but a lot of them also lived in, the digital kind of pockets of a lot of our relationship managers. And so there were definitely some opportunity for us to improve on that. And about 2 years ago, there were a couple of internal and external factors that really kind of prompted us to do this, or to kind of go through this strategic shift that allowed us to address some of the gaps that I just shared. It's no surprise, COVID had a pretty significant and pretty detrimental impact on kind of the financial well-being of a lot of the country, but particularly for those who are most vulnerable. And so between a lack of federal funding that dropped off a few years after COVID, increased inflation, and other factors, we just saw our vulnerable customers struggling even more to pay their bills. And for us, we consider that a failure. So we knew that we needed to step up in that sense. On DTE's side, we also were ramping up our investment in infrastructure to build a more resilient grid, right? Resilient to weather, to the changing in our kind of generation and energy sources. And at the same time, as I mentioned, we're also transitioning off of coal on our clean energy journey and ramping up our renewables. And so all of these things have a direct impact on our customers and on our community, and so warranted this kind of enhanced and deeper level of outreach and engagement. And so with all of these kind of factors at play, we really kind of went through this shift, first and foremost, really, I think, redefining or maybe defining a much clearer strategy on what we're trying to do, which included not only building trust with our customers and stakeholders around those kind of DTE related initiatives that I just shared, but also building a stronger base of advocates that we could lean on, both for support, for some kind of real talk and feedback on what's working and not working, but also to help us, spread the message and address any misinformation that might be out there, as part of our efforts, and for any advocacy that we might engage them in as well. And with that in place, the second part of this was also more internally focused, but really thinking about how are we measuring our work, and how do we kind of prove that impact? How do we know we're doing the right things in order to be able to achieve kind of that strategic objective of building that trust and building our advocate base? And so, with those in place, we really translated the kind of strategic shift into three more tactical actions that we took. First was around remapping our universe. So understanding who is our sphere of influence, who our audience is, and kind of really needing to broaden it because the work called for that. Two was around evaluating our stakeholders, right? And understanding where do they stand with us or on us before we know how we can actually move them anywhere, and how we might work with them. And then, of course, third is tracking that progress, tactically measuring the impact, and also importantly, telling that story. So digging into the remapping of the universe piece, as I mentioned a few minutes ago, we weren't starting from scratch. We had a really good, strong base of relationships that we had. We had strong relationships with faith-based institutions. We had a great coalition that we leaned on to conduct outreach, again, to get feedback, kind of where the needs were. We worked closely with social service organizations, again, because we have a large group population of vulnerable customers that we support. We're a very diverse region and state, and so we had a strong base of multicultural organizations. But I think that, and in a positive, we had strong pockets of these relationships, but that also posed a little bit of the challenge, because while we had strong relationships in Detroit, for example, where our headquarters is, where the most, highest number of residents live in the state, and the highest percentage of vulnerable customers, and a couple of other pockets that didn't represent the full service territory and the extent of the service territory of where our work was going to be done. And so we went through an exercise to understand, to kind of remap our universe, but really to understand where our gaps were. For us, the criteria that we defined was around geography. So making sure that we had good representation across our service territory. So we looked at counties. We even dug into particular cities within counties to understand where we had stakeholders and what our current base was, and where we needed to build more. We also really focused on making sure that the organizations and stakeholders in our mix really were representative of the community. While we had a strong faith-based network, it wasn't kind of balanced in being inclusive of all faiths. Same thing for multicultural organizations. And so we really identified those gaps and have now focused on closing them and really kind of broadening and deepening our network in that sense. And lastly, we also thought about centers of influence. That's another consideration, either because some individuals are influential in their community without being tied to a particular organization, or because, certain cities, certain communities have a strong voice and influence others around them. And so understanding those dynamics was really important. And the way that we kind of pursued the steps on trying to close these gaps was twofold. One was we obviously used Quorum. We kind of input all of our stakeholders into Quorum. We put in cities, we put in counties. So we ended up doing that initial mapping to know where we stand first. Then we actually worked with a lot of our internal business units, governmental affairs, our partners in crime. I mean, they provide so much insight on what's happening on the political and on the local government front that informs kind of where and how we should be engaging on the community side. So they were definitely one of our trusted kind of internal partners on who and where we should be talking to. But we also worked with other business units, our energy efficiency team, energy assistance, environmental, others in the company who have relationships with community organizations, but that our team might not have it. And so, that allowed us to have a much warmer handoff and to deepen the relationship with these organizations beyond the business unit. We didn't take it over, we just kind of added to it. And then some of it involved cold calling, right? Or kind of really doing or reaching out and kind of starting from scratch. For example, we really wanted to get connected with HOAs, block clubs, neighborhood associations. So we needed to, in Detroit, we went to the city of Detroit, who has a very robust 500 plus block club network, and worked with the city to get in touch with them. In other communities and with HOAs in suburban communities, it's a little bit harder. And so we are working through, sometimes it's onesie twosies, sometimes it's local government, sometimes it's alternative kind of consortiums that might be able to put in touch with that. And so, it's we try to be as efficient and as intentional as possible, but yeah, sometimes it's it's a little bit of cold calling to make that first contact. The last thing I'll add here before moving on to the next step is that the gap analysis is not a static step. The community is dynamic. The community is changing, needs, influences, et cetera. And so we have made this an annual part of our annual planning process where we evaluate those gaps, both see how we've done on the progress, but also make sure that the gaps that we've identified are still the right ones that we need to focus on. And then we also have quarterly kind of progress check-ins with our teams to make sure that, the gaps that we set out to address, that we don't only talk about them in January and December, but that every quarter we measure progress, talk through some of the challenges or successes, and also try to cross-pollinate across our different regions so that we can learn from one another on maybe what's worked. So, so with kind of the gap analysis and this remapping and broadening of the universe underway, we then transition into the next step around evaluating our stakeholders and really developing a framework for how to think about our stakeholders and how to measure that kind of that movement of that shift. The unfortunate part, and I think most of you would agree, is that not all stakeholders are created equal. And I say that primarily because of limited and finite resources. Our team is small. While we would love to be able to connect with every customer and every community organization, we just simply don't have the capacity to do that. And so we needed to find a way to prioritize and to evaluate where stakeholders stood and who we needed to focus on. So the framework that we put together, particularly in light of maybe the goal of building a stronger advocate base, was really to measure stakeholders' sentiment towards DTE and how they act or don't act on that. So starting with detractors, we define those as stakeholders who were opposed to DTE in one way or another, and who took a vocal or public stance or would publicly speak out against us. Those who are neutrals, may not like us, may be kind of neutral, may have some opposition, but they are not vocal kind of around it, but they might reach out to us and tell us how they feel and kind of want to work through that. Our supporters are those who are aligned and understand and again, support that work, but aren't kind of publicly doing so. And then our advocates are those supporters who are willing to, kind of raise their hand, stand alongside us and say, I support this initiative that DTE is doing, again, kind of correct some of that misinformation, or lend their voice in some sort of public way. And so, again, we went through a process of evaluating every single organization using this framework. We also took into consideration stakeholder level of influence, their reach, as we kind of went through this. And not only did we use Quorum again for tracking all of this, but we also put in processes to do quarterly check-ins on how are stakeholders doing, how are we moving the needle, and kind of moving them up this segmentation curve. And so with those two kind of steps in place, the last phase of implementing this strategic shift was really around building systems in order to be able to track our progress. And, we already had started using Quorum in some of the earlier steps, but I think this is really where it came in full force. As I said, our stakeholders lived in Excel before, partial logging, all over the place. And so we, at this point in particular, made a decision to move all of our tracking, all of our interaction, everything into Quorum for contacts who are associated with organizations, the organizations themselves, and all interactions. We also use, Quorum for things like stakeholder newsletters, event invitations, et cetera, but those are kind of more one-offs. The engagements and the stakeholder management, all of that went in, including sentiment, their priority, the geography, the organization type, and other kind of criteria or ways that we kind of bucket or, track them. All of that went into Quorum. And alongside that, we also put in processes in place to ensure that this work was being done and the tracking was being done on an ongoing basis. Not sure if I mentioned it before, but we actually had Quorum for 5+ years, definitely well before this shift that we took, but we used it sparingly. And it wasn't until we took this, kind of created this forcing mechanism of connecting our scorecard to Quorum in the sense that all of the data and all of the metrics would come from Quorum. It wasn't until we made that connection that it really ensured that everything that needed to be tracked was being tracked and was being tracked through this one system. The mentality we said is if it's not in Quorum, it doesn't exist. And so that was a really, really effective way for us to now have a robust and complete database that not only allows us to measure that progress, but also allows us to have that institutional knowledge stored, right, for employee transitions, relationship handoffs. Obviously the company and the stakeholders are going to live on beyond any one of us. And so that's another added benefit that this shift has really provided us. And so with these 3 steps in place, what it allowed us to do is to measure that impact, both to know if we're making progress in the right ways and on the right goals, but also to instill confidence internally with our executives and internal stakeholders that, the day-to-day work that we're doing is ultimately going to lead to kind of the outcomes of that strategic shift that we outlined. And so that's been really, really exciting. The couple of measures of success that we have, I'll maybe actually start at the bottom. So what we call our leading indicators, or these high impact metrics that measure that day-to-day activity that ultimately yields those long-term results. We operate at a regional level, and so we measure our stakeholder engagements by region, number of customers and number of vulnerable customers reached by region, and the number of new stakeholders added, both by region, but also by gaps, as I mentioned as well. These are the day-to-day metrics that if we the thought is that if we do these steps, right, and if they're done with intention, then we'll actually see movement on those top line metrics around shifting our stakeholders up that sentiment curve, which we track, as I mentioned, on a quarterly basis through our kind of strategic progress check-ins, and that we will in the long run be able to positively impact our stakeholder sentiment. Now, our kind of sentiment segmentation curve that we created is something that each of our relationship managers evaluates, on their own. And so what we also put into place to really get a better sense of how our stakeholders feel and hear directly from them is a semi-annual stakeholder survey that both asks them how do they feel about DTE on reliability, on affordability, clean energy, community presence, a number of other things, but also asks about their level of familiarity with those same level of initiatives. And what this has allowed us to do is to validate that how we think we're doing is really how our stakeholders are feeling. But it's also given us some really great insights that the more our stakeholders are informed and the more they are aware of our work, the more positively they actually feel about the company and that work. So it's a validation that our education and awareness efforts are actually having an impact on their sentiment. And that sentiment, of course, is part of building trust and trusted relationship with those stakeholders. So that's kind of how that all comes full circle. So, like I said, with all of this in place, I feel like we've made significant progress in telling our stories to our executives, building support and understanding for the work that we do, but also using this to make that tangible difference towards building trust with our stakeholders, building those lasting relationships, and also building that kind of advocate base that we talked about. So, all of that work was a big undertaking, right? It's administrative. It required a lot of change, kind of like behavioral change from our teams. But the real work, is really in the engagement. All of the work that I just walked through is really the underlying, the systems, the infrastructure, the tools to support our relationship managers. But what it actually takes to build trust is that one-on-one, that human interaction. And so I wanted to highlight a couple of things here. Particularly as we build new relationships, and in these last new years, as we brought new stakeholders into our universe, we really start with listening tours. So as much as we might have our own agenda of what we want to talk to them about, listening and understanding what their needs and their priorities are is the first point of building trust, because you set the tone for this is going to be a two-way kind of mutual relationship as opposed to a one-way give and take. And at the same time, it also allows you to identify opportunities to build that relationship further, for partnership, for support, for issue resolution, whatever that might be. The second kind of focus for us is to really focus on the value to the community. And I'd add that it's specifically around making and focusing on local impact to the community. So we really think about kind of messaging, programs, resources that are tailored to each community, each stakeholder individually. One example I'll share is, when we talk about reliabilities, I mentioned we're investing billions over the next few years in improving our infrastructure. But talking about it in that sense to a community like Pontiac or Ann Arbor, it doesn't mean anything to them. It's not personal. It's not tangible. And so we've really shifted that narrative into here's what we're doing in your community. We're going to be trimming trees on these blocks. We're going to be building a new substation that's going to impact this community. We're going to be replacing pole tops here at this particular time. And this is the impact. This is the improvement in reliability that you pick a community can actually expect. To support this, really excited. We launched this a year ago, maybe at this point, but we actually launched a platform where customers can see this information, type in their address, type in their city, and actually see the past, current, and future work that's planned. But the underlying concept, whether you've got a platform or not, is really around personalizing and localizing that information so that you're focused on what is it. You're showing them that, hey, I know what you need, I heard you, and I'm doing something about it. And the last piece, kind of building on the fact that this is really an engagement and a two-way conversation is that follow-up is everything, right? One conversation, one sit down isn't going to change your relationship, but hearing them responding to stakeholder needs is I think really where you build that trust to show that, hey, I'm invested in you. I might be asking something of you, but I'm invested in you and seeing you succeed. And one example I wanted to share here is, our faith-based partners, again, are just have such a great pulse on the community. And prior to COVID, we had eliminated some representatives who used to be kind of situated in churches to help address customer questions and help connect customers to energy assistance programs. So we closed that program down, and particularly coming out of COVID, again, because the need had really grown, we really heard feedback of, hey, from our faith-based partners, this is an issue. Our vulnerable customers depended on it. Like we need to find a solution. What we could have done is said, we hear you, but here's the reasons why this program got eliminated. There's not really much that we could do, right? We show that we heard them, but we didn't really necessarily do anything about it. And we took a different approach of trying to find kind of an innovative solution that addressed their needs, but allowed us to work within our resources and constraints. And so we kind of middle of last year launched mobile customer offices, which are rotating teams of customer service representatives who go to select communities where we know there's either vulnerable customers or they've asked for it. And we are there during the day to offer them a person to ask questions about their bills, help them get connected to energy assistance resources, shutoffs, any other questions that they might have, but might prefer that in-person connection. And so, again, that's just one example, but it's being able to listen and to respond to stakeholder needs and asks that really kind of builds that mutual relationship as opposed to that one-sided one. Obviously, in the midst of everything, we also talk about our priorities, our projects, and find opportunities to kind of to share that. But again, it always needs to be two ways. And I think, to maybe kind of close out around kind of what DTE is doing and beyond what our community engagement team does, I wanted to highlight some things that our company does and our employees do, because I imagine many of you also have similar, you might have engagement or community affairs teams, but your company and employees might be doing substantially more. And while that in itself is great, there is an opportunity from a stakeholder community engagement perspective to really leverage that and activate it in a more kind of strategically aligned effort to advance your objectives. And I'm talking about employee volunteerism, corporate sponsorships, or establishing employee ambassadors. For example, we place employees on boards, right? All of that can and probably is happening already, but finding volunteer opportunities for employees with partners that you're looking to build a relationship with, or with community organizations who have raised their hand and said, hey, I need help, right? Or putting a board member on an organization that you're maybe trying to get into that advocate kind of space for you, can't, the work doesn't change. It's just about kind of plugging it in to your strategy and taking that to the next level. And of course, in the midst of all of this, making sure that you tell that story. As I said, if it doesn't, if it's not a quorum, it doesn't exist internally. But if people don't know about the work that you and your company are doing, it also doesn't exist for them. So whether it's through blogs, through news segments, or through social media, which is probably the easiest one for all employees, right, to do, just make sure that you're telling that story and kind of getting your message amplified out there. So that's really all I wanted to share around DTE and what we've done. But maybe in closing and kind of in summary, just wanted to share 5 kind of tips or takeaways for any of you who might be thinking about doing a revamp of your engagement strategy, or maybe starting some of this work from scratch for your organization. The first one, should be no surprise, is really making sure that you have a very well-defined primary objective. This was, I think, a really pivotal moment for us, but it's really important because if you pursue an education and advocacy or education and awareness campaign versus an advocacy campaign versus you're trying to mitigate some risk or you're trying to get a specific project off the ground and get community support, depending on what your objective is in that moment, who you target, how you engage them, and how you measure progress is all going to change. So it really all comes from this, and the rest of it really is impacted by the goals that you're trying to accomplish. 2, start with that framework, right? Defining who your stakeholders are. How do you segment them? How do you kind of evaluate them? And I shared some examples and some criteria that we used that again worked for us, but you need to make that relevant for you and your particular objectives, as well as your geographic coverage, your audience, and who's kind of in your universe. The third one is to select metrics that matter. I shared with you, we've gone through so many iterations of metrics, finally landing on ones that stuck, and that was really important in kind of helping us understand how we're making progress in really telling our story around the impact that we are making. And so, again, thinking about what is your goal and then really selecting metrics that matter. Take into consideration, your company culture, kind of other metrics that might exist across the enterprise, and that should inform kind of what your particular metrics might be. Number 4 is making sure that you have the systems, in place, or the system in place for your one source of truth. Like I said, for us, the transition to Quorum was pretty transformational in both just as having that single point of data or information, but also for a lot of the functionality and the reduction in the administrative burden that we carried in managing Excel spreadsheets and manipulating data. And so there's some really great functionality that has allowed us to do more, but require less effort in order to do that. So just think about that. Obviously, Excel is fine. But my suggestion overall is pick a system and kind of stick with it, because that consistency and that centralization is really important. And the last piece is to build kind of the processes in order to track your progress, to measure that work, right? Weekly scorecards, quarterly check-ins. That's what worked for us. My recommendation, and from our experience, that weekly is burdensome, but it does create that level of accountability and kind of trains the muscle with our relationship managers that that you need to train. I mean, look, we're all people, right? Like we're not perfect. And sometimes you just need a little bit of structure in order to kind of get going. And over time, you can evaluate whether that cadence is good or if you can move to a less frequent one to manage that, again, kind of that administrative impact. So that's really all I wanted to share with you today. I know Q&A is next, but I just wanted to say thank you for the opportunity to share our journey. This was actually a really great kind of exercise to reflect on the last decade as I prepared for this, because we've really accomplished a lot, right? We have lots more work to do, a lot further to go. I have lots of improvements and things like that are on the horizon, but we've been through a lot, and it really, like I said, preparing for this is really just, I think, helped me maybe appreciate and recognize the positive kind of improvements that we've made. So with that, I turn it over to Q&A. Patrick, I know you're back, and I'm really excited to hear what others are working on and maybe what's worked for you. So thank you again.
Yeah, well, we're getting a lot of love for DTE in the chat too. So I love this one. I'm a former Challenge Detroit fellow and had some great friends in the community engagement department at DTE, which love to see that. All right, I'll save some of these like quorum questions to the end and ask a few more of these that are a little bit more like best practice-y. Okay, here's one. Do you have a checklist or litmus test for each stakeholder type, like advocate? So as you're thinking about like mapping folks on like, all right, are they a detractor, advocate, XYZ? Do you have like a defined list of what makes something or someone a supporter versus an advocate? Or is it more like, qualitative, just based off how you're feeling?
It's probably a little bit of both. As I mentioned, kind of the definitions that we have, those are really the definitions. And so it's one of those things where if somebody, let's say somebody's neutral in our network, but publishes an op-ed that's anti-DT. That is kind of a very tangible point that that prompts us to put them in the detractor category. If we call upon someone, let's say, we recently did a lot of advocacy for some energy assistance reform legislation, and we're asking people to go to Lansing to advocate for expansion of energy assistance funding, expansion of the program. So sometimes, right, when we ask the question and knowing the answer, that will then prompt us to either say, yes, they're an advocate because they're willing to do that, or no, if someone is an advocate, but they say no, that might kind of cause them to shift. So it's not quite a checklist, but we do use kind of those actionable moments to kind of validate where they fall on that segmentation.
Yeah, I think that's a great balance of not overbuilding a system, but also not making it so loosey-goosey that you can just, sure, they're an advocate. Why not? All right, got a couple of other great questions in here. How do you pitch a shift in systems internally? So I'm sure that there was a lot of internal stakeholder management just within the organization to get folks adopted onto the platform, all that kind of fun stuff. How did you really pitch that internally to get everybody on board?
Yeah. So for us, I think it was there were a couple of things. We were in a unique position where DTE already had a license, for example, for Quorum from a systems perspective. So that eliminated the cost because our governmental affairs team had already started using the tool. And again, we were using it, but using it sparingly. But that eliminated the burden. And I'll maybe go back to kind of, how to make the case for it. The other piece was really thinking about kind of making the case for what are the benefits of the system, right? From, pitching to our executive to approve kind of this shift. I really focused on how is this tool going to help us achieve the larger objectives, right? Reporting to executives, showing progress, kind of tracking that movement and really tying it to those big picture goals. while that was a talking point with our team, I really, on the team, focused on the simplicity of the tool and the reduction in the administrative burden, because I knew that was a pain point with kind of the Excel and other tools that we were using. So I tried to tailor that to kind of to the audience in order to make that case. And, I mean, ultimately our leader approved this. And so we made the transition, but I think particularly with our team, what helped is that they felt like we heard them of, hey, this is a pain point. And so when we walk through it, it's like, hey, you're not going to have to do X, Y, and Z. You're not going to have to enter duplicate information because Quorum eliminates that. You can do things automatically. We can bulk upload information really easily, et cetera. And so those things they were really receptive to and made that adoption substantially easier.
Yeah, I love that. I love it, especially when they've had, pain in a workflow before, being like, all right, I've heard you. That is frustrating, and here's how we're alleviating it. Like, they're like, I'll use this. I do not want to go back to the way things were before. All right.
Exactly. Yeah.
Got another great question here is about follow-up. You said, and I couldn't agree more that like it's not just the meeting that you have. Like you can have a billion meetings. It's about like the actions and what you do afterwards. And like even just like that last follow-up email can mean so much if it contains, the right info, right? So I'm curious, like, is there a way for you that you and your team track that follow-up for meetings and things like that? Like, what does that look like for you and your team?
Yeah, the follow-up for us from a tracking perspective is not as we don't track it in Quorum or in a structured way, although the functionality is there. We really leave it to our team in order to do that, right? So we have a follow-up field in our interaction log in Quorum, and some team members do it. But for example, my team and I don't like track to see if they're staying on top of it. I mean, ultimately it's their relationship. And so ultimately it's kind of up to them to manage that. That being said, if the follow-up is some sort of a project or initiative, right, that's more than, hey, I need to call you back, we absolutely, that kind of prompts a working team, a project plan. And so there's definitely follow up there in the sense that, there's a whole team working on it. The one thing I'll maybe add is that DTE has an internal system that we use. We call it I Can Help, but it's where any employee who interacts with a customer and who has an issue can submit this issue and escalate it to the right department. And so that's maybe part of the reason we don't use kind of our interaction log and Quorum so much is because, for DTE, we actually go to any issue resolution like, hey, I've been trying to call, to get a tree trimmed in my backyard and no one's called me back, whatever the issue is. We use that system. And so that, that gets managed. There's a whole process around it. We don't necessarily do that ourselves.
That makes sense. Love the idea of having some kind of system internally that says like, hey, I need help with XYZ. And it's really easy for your team they can all hop in, right?
It's pretty amazing. I mean, they also have, their process is that within 2 business days, someone from DTE gets back to them and that within 10 days, there's a resolution. So for someone who may be like playing phone tag or trying to work with DTE for weeks or months on end, it's, the system and the process that they build are just incredible at like, getting customers the resolution, but it also kind of makes us look good because we make that connection for them. And then we kind of deliver because the company delivers on resolving that. So
totally. All right. We got a couple other really great questions in here. How do you decide if a person is worth tracking?
So, yeah, I mean, here's what I'll say. There's no stakeholder that, if we engage with them, that we don't kind of track. I mean, if we've connected with them in any way, they are part of our universe. But, as I talked about, we kind of we talk a little bit about prioritization. And so we have, different kind of tiers. There's folks who, we've reached out to multiple times, who maybe don't call us back. They kind of go into a tier 5, and we don't necessarily, maybe we check in with them every year to see that. Stakeholders we've never interacted with are a different tier, kind of different category, so that we have a chance to work off of that list because new folks might be introduced to us. And so we have these kind of categories of like highest priority, meaning highest touch, like whether it's because they're a stakeholder who wants that regular touch point, or because we're actively trying to work on something with them, we use that kind of prioritization system in order to evaluate that. But there's no stakeholder, like I said, that we don't track once we've been connected or introduced to them. It's just the level of interaction that depends on kind of where they fall.
Yeah, exactly. If they're reaching out and they're in your orbit, they matter, right? So another great question here, which is the pushback I've received is that people already have very busy schedules, which prevents them from learning and adopting new systems. What tools or tactics have you used that were effective in situations like this? I guess anytime you're introducing a new system, folks are already busy, and even if your system's trying to make it so they're less busy, that curve can be tough for folks. Do you have any advice on helping people adopt new systems?
I mean, I think I'll go back to maybe an earlier answer. One is having kind of an executive mandate is, it forces it to make that transition. So you kind of have to adopt it. 2, as I talked about, because we tied our metrics to Quorum, which was the system that we chose, people can choose not to interact with it, but then their metrics and their performance isn't going to be reflected. And so like that, that really drove the most of it. But the last piece, and in a more positive way, like I said, we really pitched that as for the benefits, and for the benefits that those using the system will experience directly, and so we continue to make improvements and streamline that to this day. So it's not over. Our latest kind of improvement we're going to be implementing is alerts for stakeholders or contacts that maybe you haven't talked to in the last 30 or 60 days, right? Like now it's making it easier of just like flagging that. You don't, our relationship managers don't need to sit there and think about who do I need to talk to or who maybe not touched. That's kind of automated. We're adding new fields for information that we're actually kind of tracking for corporate giving and others elsewhere. We're integrating that so that it's a single source of information. We're not having to duplicate that. And so that those benefits compared to the system or the process we used before has been really effective at helping people not only like have to use the system, but actually want to use it.
Totally. I love all of those points. The piece about if it's not in this, it didn't happen and you don't get credit for it, I thought is great. Like at a previous company I worked at, we had, a mandate to log interactions. And it wasn't until they introduced like a leaderboard on who is logging the most interactions and then set expectations on you need to log XYZ amount, is that's actually when people started using it. It was when it became very clear that, logging the interactions, like that's how you get credit for it. You already did the hard work. You already did 99% of the work. Just that like one little bit.
Exactly.
All right. Here's an interesting question from Patrick. I love a good Patrick question. What is the most powerful metric that you track through Quorum, either in interaction or on stakeholder basis? And if I can add on to this, like if you had to say like what metric leadership cared about the most, what do you think that would be?
I'm going to pick. Well, so I think that's a very good question. I think that probably the most powerful metric is really that sentiment survey, because that is direct feedback from our stakeholders on how they feel, how things are changing over time. Is the work that we're doing and tracking on a day-to-day basis, is that really yielding the results? So I think that that kind of validates, or perhaps doesn't. For the most part, it's validated so far. And I think it's the most trusted metric because it's coming directly from the stakeholders.
Yeah.
So that's kind of the most, I think, valuable one. But the other, and a close second, is the kind of the stakeholder kind of distribution along that segmentation curve, and particularly us tracking. We select specific stakeholders that we want to move. Others might move naturally, but not as intentionally, but there's some that we're intentionally moving. And so that is a very close second, because those are ones that we are actively working with to move. And so us being able to track that, and speak to that, and then ultimately, hopefully deliver on that when those stakeholders show up, two events show up for us, that's when it really comes full circle. So I'd say that's a close second.
Yeah,
That's the question.
Great. And so kind of related to that, another great question that came in is about how do you track like key stakeholders? So you mentioned that you track everybody that interacts with you, right? Because if they're engaging with you, they're important, right? But I'm sure you can think of a few like really key ones that are a lot more, influential than others. Are there other expectations that you have set for managing with these key stakeholders, or do you have other systems or other things that you use in order to make sure that you're keeping up with these folks, or is everybody kind of in the same pod here?
Everyone's in the same spot. I think, but again, kind of the categories to the prioritization that they fall into, we might look at them with, as we do our quarterly check-ins, for example, we might focus more of the discussion on the higher priority, the advocates, the ones that we're targeting, versus others are, it's good to know that they're there, right? They're, we monitor it, how things are shifting, but not at that granular of a level. But in terms of the, that's probably the only way that we do that.
Got it. Makes sense. That makes sense.
Obviously, the one thing I'll add is obviously the level of engagement with those folks is elevated. So, I mean, that's how the relationship is actually managed. But from a tracking standpoint, the systems we use are all exactly the same.
Sounds good. That makes a lot of sense. It should all be in one spot, right?
Exactly. Can't say that enough.
Exactly. All right. We have, I think, 2 minutes left. So I'm going to do like a really fast, like lightning round of answering a bunch of these that are related to Quorum as well. All right. Do you have the ability to email all stakeholders as a part of Quorum to send that survey? Yes, you definitely do. As a part of Grassroots and Stakeholder product, you can use it as a CRM where you can email all your folks through Outbox. If you use Outbox for emailing federal and state officials, it's a very, very similar process. Can you share what a scorecard or dashboard looks like? Is this something that Quorum, they created in DTE or outside of Quorum? Yes, you can definitely create scorecards and dashboards in Quorum. The one that we had shared previously was an example that I had built, hence the typo. Not the one that Alyssa's team uses in Quorum, but the examples are ones that you can absolutely do in Quorum. Let's see, what else do we got here? If our organization has Quorum Grassroots, can you share the capabilities related to stakeholder engagement and how this is different? Yeah, so Grassroots is great when it comes to engaging with all of your advocates. So getting them to write to members of Congress, record videos, and some of our new interactive campaigns as well that we recently launched. Where Stakeholder is really great is managing some of these more key relationships where you want to log interactions with folks and really get the rest of your team involved in engaging with these people. So some ways that folks have explained it to me that they liked it is they have Quorum Grassroots for activating all of their advocates and Stakeholder for some more of their like grass tops advocacy as well. All right. Is there a way to import stakeholders en masse to Quorum, and are you able to track social media similar to elected officials? Yes, you can definitely bulk upload your stakeholders into Quorum. That's how most folks get started. You already have like an Excel spreadsheet, and we get that spreadsheet up into Quorum. And then, yes, you are able to track social media that is not built in directly to the stakeholder product, but you can talk to our team about adding it in as well. So I believe it is a quick additional fee there. All right, let's see if I can get a couple more in. Does Quorum have a way of reaching out to internal people to map relationships? Yep. In the stakeholder product, there's the external interaction logger where they can log interactions that they have, and they don't have to be Quorum users, and the same thing with relationships. So they can say, I have a relationship with XYZ person. It's a great way to get things started. All right. Whew. Man, my mouth is getting dry. My LaCroix is going to be working overtime. Alissa, thank you so much for joining us. Really, really appreciate you sharing your advice and tips and knowledge with our whole audience here.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. And I did drop my email in the chat if anyone has any follow-up questions or wants to talk further. So happy to connect.